Okay, yeah, now I can come out into the audience.
Right.
Do the whole Donahue thing.
Right, exactly.
So, do you want to start?
Yes. You and I have a history of talking about cyberpunk and the transhuman, and we've had an interesting conversation about what is the difference between the cyberpunk and the transhuman. Is it the cyborg that's the relationship in between? How distant are our cousins in our relationships? So I'm going to ask Aryu to tell us what he thinks about the cyberpunk culture and the transhuman culture, and start it off that way. And then I'm going to interject some thoughts, and then we're going to welcome the audience to participate as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, in sort of an email back and forth, one thing that Natasha asked me was, why are cyberpunk writers so critical and negative regarding transhumanism? I mean, first of all, I've had to point out that the cyberpunk writers are transhumanists, you know, because they all wear glasses. And probably use birth control and will accept an implant as necessary, and, you know, are carrying around these smart things in their pockets and all that stuff. So, I mean, part of it is this question of identity. So they don't relate to being part of, say, organized transhumanism. They don't relate to the idea of self-identifying as transhumanists. Now you have to think about cyberpunk. They also didn't like being cyberpunks. Cyberpunk was a genre of science fiction, and then it was sort of a cultural memeplex, where these different various cultural streams, like cyberpunk science fiction, like virtual reality, like hacking and cracking, and like industrial art, and, you know, Mark Pauline, Survival Research Labs, pranks, drugs, all these things sort of merged together, and people would throw parties about it. And you'd go to a party, and maybe the party was cyberpunk, and when you went home, you didn't think, gee, I'm a cyberpunk, you know, what are my beliefs in relation to cyberpunk? Whereas people in transhumanism would tend to take that more seriously. Say, yeah, I'm a transhumanist, and, you know, these are my positions on transhumanism, these are yours. So I think, since this is a conference about writing, it behooves us to talk about the nature of writers, and particularly the nature of creative writers, as compared to, say, polemicists or essay writers and so forth. And I think that creative writers and artists in general probably use different parts of the brain than, say, programmers do, although there's some overlap there, than people who are writing essays, people who are trying very hard to illuminate a point very explicitly so that you will understand. And I think when I was at the Singularity Conference a few weeks ago, Ray Kurzweil was speaking, and he said, you know, scientists and artists illuminate our world. And as a creative writer, I thought, well, first of all, creative writers try to eliminate cliches. So, you know, illuminate our world, maybe there's some of that. A lot of creative writing wants to push you right over the edge of that world, leave you sort of hanging in the void to figure it out for yourself. The desire is there to evoke.
Pay no attention to the curtain behind the mirror.
I was going to play a prank on him.
To evoke, provoke, play pranks, etc., etc. So, and I also think, I mean, if you look at the role of writers in earlier time throughout history, you know, the whole thing about life being nasty, short, and brutish, which, you know, there's some argument among anthropologists whether that was always the case, but certainly is the case in a lot of situations, and certainly the case also in the 20th century, which many of us lived through. And, you know, for many writers, maybe for most writers, their roles were oppositional, satirical, bringing forth what we might call the bad conscience or the weird subconscious conscience of human beings. And then really in the 20th century, it was really about puncturing sort of the smooth surface of advertising, of politics and so forth, and getting at that creepy stuff that's going on underneath that. So I think in terms of the 21st century and, you know, cyberpunk writers maybe being sort of negative and dark and critical and so, have we really come so far that now is the time to put that behind us and not be critical and not show the dark visions and not show sort of the nasty stuff under the surface? I don't think we have. And the last point I'll make before I let other people start participating in this is, you know, I think certainly Neil Stephenson has made an interesting call for writers to write books that will inspire people to do things in a positive way. And I think that can be really transgressive in a culture, you know, sort of a Hollywood culture where you know, you have to have the apocalyptic scenario and you have to have the gloom and doom and so forth. But I think it can go either way. And I think if you go from sort of the lecture that you might get at Humanity Plus thing where Natasha is coming up and presenting her view of the great things that might happen in the world, and Aubrey comes up and does his thing, and Are You Sirius maybe does a positive thing, but he's a little suspect, but, you know, nevertheless does, you know, looks at the glorious future that Timothy Leary sold him or whatever. But then, okay, so that's the public persona, and that's the idea. But then if you look beneath the surface, if you're looking for stories, well, maybe Natasha's life is actually a little weird, and my life is a little weird, and Aubrey de Grey's life is a little weird, and, you know, so, and you can look at those things, and they can either become sort of a hero's journey, or they can become a farce, and it depends on what the writer wants to do, and in some ways it depends on where we end up. You know, if we you know, all of our hopes and predictions and dreams might get, you know, buried under the waves, literally, and in which case it's a different story than the hero's journey. So, anyway, that's the beginning of my rant here.
So, what we'd like to do is take it to the audience and have you ask any questions that you'd like or make any comments on RU's perspective on this cyberpunk and the relationship between the cyberpunk and the idea of the dystopic future, the idea of questioning and concerning, and what about the radical cyberpunk? What about all that cyberpunk set out to do early on with Mondo 2000 and Anonymous, really? Okay, yes.
So yeah, I saw Stevenson speak at Black Hat, and I was skeptical about that. He had this vision that the science fiction writers are going to like influence engineers, you know, with their positive vision.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of skeptical of that. It seems to me like if engineers don't have, I think that the engineers are formed by the same environments that form the writers. And I'm skeptical that, do you actually think that the writers are going to set the zeitgeist of the time and to really, like, you know,
well, I think,
people thinking? You know?
Actually, I mean, I think they did and perhaps will, and it doesn't have to be a positive vision. I mean, you know, William Gibson invented cyberspace in a trilogy that many people interpreted as dystopian. He didn't think of it as dystopian, but many people saw it that way. But all people say, "Oh yeah, let's do that." And I mean, there's a great book on robotics and DARPA and so forth that talks about people being inspired by the James Cameron films, Terminator, so forth. So I mean.
Earlier generation, Robert Heinlein.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, science fiction. I'm not so sure it matters whether the narrative is encouraging or dark or whatever. It's more like a lot of technologists read science fiction and get inspiration for ideas from there. So I'm not sure if what Stevenson is advocating is actually necessarily important, but it does perhaps represent a change of vibes for a generation where there are young people coming up who are, you know, to coin a phrase, sort of hip, but not so much into the punk attitude, and they can be sort of just really positive about what they're trying to do, and that's a good thing too. Maybe they'll be inspired by some of the ideas raised in these kinds of science fiction. Brad.
So I'll channel David Brin a bit by asking the room, how many of you have never thought other than that the current decade is the best decade ever? Right? Has anyone not thought that the current decade is the best decade ever?
Well, just going back more
Yeah. Okay, because I think most of the people in this movement seem to think the world's getting consistently better in many ways. But there are a lot of people who don't think that. There are a lot of people who have the nostalgic view. They have the they have the golden age view. And I think this characterizes the two things you're going to see. In addition, of course, to this, the desire of writers to tell a story that's dark and has conflict. Right. We basically just see these two worldviews. Is the future better than the past, or was the past better than the present? And you're going to get two genres of thinking just from those two worldviews, I think.
I think what you're saying is the present better than the past?
Well, I think the present is better than the past.
Right, but I think that people who might project a darker future may feel that the present is worse than the past. I mean, I'm not sure how you weigh all these things. I like the ambiguity that it's worse in some ways. It's better.
Well, sorry, it's not a.
So,
it's clearly not a black and white thing.
You have.
The past has one thing going for it. It's certain.
Yeah.
You obviously have never studied history. If you
actually, the past may be more open to interpretation than the future. Actually. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, back there.
Those who remember history are condemned to watching horror knowing that we're repeating it.
Yes, speak up, yes.
Yeah, so my question is, you mentioned William Gibson, and, when I read Neuromancer, it's very interesting, but it's not a future I'd ever want to be part of. So I'm wondering, is it possible, is it necessary, or is it interesting to write about a future that we would want to be part of, in the sense that there's less suffering and there's more happiness shared among living beings? Is such a future as compelling as one that's devastatingly dark?
I am not as stated like that, but I think that any writer can bring in compelling characters and compelling situations, and then, I use this word ambiguity a lot, but then there's going to have to be some ambiguity in there and some challenges and so forth. But I mean, it's plausible. I think are there any really good utopian novels?
There's one over there.
Diamond Age, sort of. Yeah, Diamond Age is sort of utopian.
It's easy to be dark, right?
What?
It's easy to be dark.
We have Kim Stanley Robinson in the audience.
I mean, if you look at Star Wars,
Yeah.
you're looking at good versus evil. You're not just focusing on the darkness.
Well, Star Wars is
when he was writing.
Star Wars is an
writing on a
authoritarian
typewriter, right?
dictatorship.
Hereditary aristocracy.
Yeah, back there.
I've actually always disagreed that cyberpunk is dystopia. It's a dystopian view of a utopian society. They are the underbelly. They're not the main society. In fact, if you look at most of them, they're deliberately avoiding the main society. They only tell you little bits and pieces of what really went on to allow the technology that they're using, however they're using, in a poor manner.
I mean, if you look at the Gibsons Trilogy, it's a society which is dominated by rogue corporations and corrupt financiers. So I think,
That sounds like
this is the future that everybody is happy to be in, and I think it's the present right now. So again, I mean, that's what calls forth a critical voice, I think. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I guess I'm having trouble with this categorizing of utopia and dystopia, because it seems to me that it's intrinsic to the genre that one person's utopia is decidedly another's utopia.
Yes.
And the inverse is also true. So it's more about the reader's interpretation or the audience. And I think some of what Aubrey was saying about the reception of his work and sort of the interaction that you have with an audience is that it does shape how you think about what you yourself say. And I know you've had this experience too. When you get labeled with something, then it's difficult to undo other people's perception of what or who you're capable of. And I think the same thing is true of authors in the texts that they put forth.
When William Gibson came to San Francisco and Berkeley in 1993, and I was going to interview him, and there were all these articles in like San Francisco Chronicle and Bay Guardian and generally kind of mainstream kind of left liberal perspectives, and there was dystopian novel, and isn't it funny that all these cyber people actually, thought this was a good idea, and I got with William Gibson, and he said, no, it's not dystopian at all. If you're living in Sarajevo, it looks incredibly sweet, and and even by my lights, there are interesting aspects of this culture that a hacker-like case could have a certain amount of freedom, sneaky freedom perhaps to do these interesting, and it's pregnant with possibilities, as is all cyberpunk writers. I mean, cyberpunks love the same kind of technologies, the stuff that's getting under the skin, the stuff that makes you much smarter, that cyborgizes you. They love all the same kinds of technologies that the transhumanists do. And I mean, they love, the extropian group. I mean, they just, right, yeah. they have never stopped sort of satirizing the extropian group as if that is, all there is to current transhumanism, which is interesting and fun. Peter?
Again, I just, your mentioning of Gibson's really interesting to me because I didn't actually ever know at the time, like what you're saying, he's saying it's not, in his view, a dystopian novel. Everyone thought, like around me, that it was, and yet I guess I was one of those people that took it as something else because, we went and tried to implement it, right? Like, cyberspace was a vision of how you interact with information. There was a bunch of us in the early 90s. We went and tried to, stupidly start companies to do that maybe, but that's what we did. We said, like, let's actually go build it. It's not just a novel, it's reality. We know how to do it.
Yeah.
So it was inspirational to me personally, not like I wanted to go live in that dystopia. I didn't seek that, although here we are. But, I saw the pieces of his book that were inspirational to me, namely data visualization. Sounds less cool than cyberspace or whatever, but that's what we went and did. We went and built it.
Yeah, I think that's true of cyberpunk writing in general, that it can be inspirational. It's more ambiguous than dystopian. I mean, there are interesting dystopian writers like J.G. Ballard, but I don't think that too many people are gonna try to do Crash.
Yeah, I was thinking about Linda Nagata, and it's the exoskeleton, the passion of the love and the relationship there. And then I started thinking about, and it's something that you're familiar with, is thinking about F.M. Esfandiari, FM 2030, who was an early transhumanist, and he was never poked fun at, really, which is interestingly enough. So it begs the question, what is it about some aspects of the concept of the transhuman that is worth poking fun at by a dystopic or dystopic scenario?
I was thinking about this in writing my book about Mondo 2000, that we used to have these things called the Reality Hackers Forum, and in 1988, and everybody I talked to remembers this, who was there. Some kid got up and said, I can make copies of my discs. We used to have discs back then, but I can't make copies of myself. And that's a problem I want to solve. And at that time, everybody was charmed by that. It was like, wow. But as it becomes more concretized and it becomes more, there's a sense that there's this ideology over here, and there's this one over here, and people start to, it's no longer charming to some people. And, people start to raise objections related to current social situations, and should we really be daydreaming about making copies of ourselves, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the closer you get to some of these things being concretized, the less charming they appear. And then Mondo was all very charming and fun, and we had the utopian and dystopian and everything in between. Back there, my friend.
Last night at the XFF party, I talked to the guy, Vale, who started research, and he pointed out that the punk movement started as direct reaction to the hippie movement. And so there's sort of a relationship of, the optimism of the hippie movement was sort of countered by the punk movement. And so perhaps transhumanism has a lot of roots in the hippie movement and such.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
At the same time, one of the other aspects of punk was do-it-yourself, and cyberpunk was do-it-yourself with technology. So all these things sort of smirched together. The punks were angry at the hippies for not not, you know, taking it far enough, or for not winning. You know, they weren't angry at the hippies because they were the new young conservatives. They were angry, you know, because they didn't follow through on their promise, and you know, their promise was impossible. But you're 19 or 20 years old. You didn't care about that. You're just, you know, you guys beat up on your parents, and now we're going to beat up on you. Yeah.
So, kind of touching on counterculture versus culture. There's ideally we would like transhumanism to be mainstream, but when something gets distributed enough, there's almost an inherent dystopian aspect of it. So, an example, what I would say is think Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook. Even if we have an affinity for some of these companies, very few people will react positively to all four. Even if they select out one of them that they really hate as the evil empire, there's almost this idea that if you get distributed enough, you are almost inherently evil. Like, we can see that's the way that Apple used to be the underdog to Microsoft, and it's almost completely switched.
Yeah, you can't. Don't be evil doesn't scale, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, and that may be a warning for you know, future transhumanist or singularitarian society, that you know, don't be evil doesn't scale.
One of the funniest things about Gibson's work was that he wrote the first 2 or 3 of them on a mechanical typewriter.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Very proud of that. I saw a hand back there. Yeah.
So the original question is, what is the difference between cyberpunk and transhumanism? I mean, it seems to me the fundamental difference is that transhumanism is fundamentally an ideology, just like vegetarianism or Marxism or republicanism. And so ideologies are things that try to minimize ambiguity. They try to make clear and sort of achieve a goal. They're teleological, whereas cyberpunk is a form of art. And so artists like to do many things. They like ambiguity because that's where interestingness and three-dimensionality occurs. And satire is one of the things that artists like to do. And so it's only natural that cyberpunk would make fun of transhumanism.
Okay, well, I have 1 minute left. This brings me to the top of the notes that I jotted down. This suspicion of ideology and a suspicion of idealism, which, you know, is not about human stories, but which is about abstract ideas. I had this thought that, I mean, literally being a transhumanist now is sort of like saying you're an oxygenist. You know, and you're just immersed in this world, and you know, so when people self-identify, then sometimes that becomes suspect. The last point I want to make is I guess I made this point already, actually. Well, I'm off the hook. I don't have to make any points at all. I think I've made all the ones that are jotted down. I can take one more question that takes a few seconds. Max.
Yeah, just to follow up on the comment back there, I partly agree with that. I think transhumanism differs from cyberpunk in that it has a clear worldview, a philosophy, which says this is the kind of world we should be creating or the direction we should be moving. Whereas cyberpunk, I don't think it's that it's aesthetic, because there's aesthetics in transhumanism, as Natasha could very well tell you. I think it's really primarily about rebellion. And that can involve aesthetics, and it can even involve little bits of ideology, perhaps. But I think it's primarily about rebellion. To me, that's what the punk part is really saying. And so it tends to be dystopic in its fiction because it's rebelling against some big established order. But it's not. That's not really the core of it. I don't think it's the dystopic part. It's the rebellious part.
Yeah, I mean, there is a rebellious part of it, and it's also, you know, when we're talking about the writers, it's just the fact that they're writing creative fiction. And so, you know, their place is to complicate things rather than. I mean, there's kind of a history of writers joining movements, and I mean, there's a great history in the 20th century, particularly the early and mid 20th century, of writers joining the Communist Party, or artists joining the Communist Party, and you know, to their credit, they were a pain in the ass when they were within the structure of a group that was trying to promote a shared belief. And the one last comment I might make is, you know, I was hired to edit H+ magazine in the early days of that magazine, and when I met with the 2 people who were meeting with me about getting this thing started, is, you know, the first thing I want to make sure is I don't want this to be Pravda for transhumanists. I wanted to have, you know, oppositional views. I wanted to have odd views. I wanted to bring in people who are outside of this culture, but who are also working within the context of this culture. So I was very proud to be able to have an interview with, that was Eric Davis talking to, I can't remember his name, even though I'm so proud of it, talking to Jonathan Lethem about Philip K. Dick. And I don't know how many transhumanists care or know about Jonathan Lethem. He's considered a really important writer, within certain culture, but I thought it was the most brilliant thing we ran in that magazine, and it was pleasing to me, but I don't know if it was pleasing to the sort of core transhumanist group. Anyway, thanks a lot. I'm gonna